Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy and the Director of the Middle East Program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation on Is Freeze for Freeze a Viable Pathway to Re-engage with Iran? And to discuss this very important and timely question, we have three really remarkable experts to help join us in the discussion. First is my colleague at CSIS, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Project on Nuclear Issues here at CSIS, Eric Brewer. From 2017 to 2018, Eric was Director for Counterproliferation at the National Security Council. We have joining us from Prague, Hanna Kaviani, who's a journalist with Radio Farda. She has followed Iran as a journalist since 2008. She's spent more than 10 years closely watching Iran's nuclear negotiations and nuclear negotiation strategy. And third, we have Henry Rome. Henry is a senior analyst with the Eurasia Group, where he focuses in part on Iran. Prior to joining the Eurasia Group, he worked in Iran at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And Henry is really, to my mind, one of the most thoughtful Iran analysts in Washington and somebody whose views I always look forward to reading. So we have, I think, a very timely set of issues. We have a Biden administration that is keenly interested in negotiating with Iran. And we have an Iranian government that seems, on the one hand, to be interested in negotiating. On the other hand, to be demonstrating its hostility. We've seen forces aligned to Iran attack US facilities in Iraqi Kurdistan. We've seen Iran doing more aggressive things on the proliferation front. So why don't we start with Eric from a technical perspective? What have the Iranians been doing on the nuclear file that people might consider provocative? And what do you think it means for the prospect of the Biden administration negotiating with the Iranians on the nuclear file?
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. Great to be with you and great to be with Hannah and Henry as well. So I think a lot of this can be traced back to a law that was passed by the Iranian parliament in December that called for some pretty aggressive and provocative steps on the nuclear front that Iran has really carried out quite expeditiously since the passage of that law. So Iran has done things like expand the use of advanced centrifuges at its nuclear facilities. It has begun enriching to 20% enriched uranium, which is much higher than the 3.67% that was allowed under the nuclear deal, and also higher than sort of the 4-ish% that it went to following the Trump administration withdrawal from the JCPOA. It's also started producing uranium metal, which is really a big deal because of the role of that process in forming the core of a nuclear weapon. And that's something that Iran knows, that's something that the international community knows. So it has been quite provocative. And then of course, the most recent step that is called for under the law, which is for Iran to stop implementing the additional protocol and a lot of the added transparency measures that were there under the JCPOA that really allowed the IAEA to have some pretty powerful inspection provisions and monitoring tools, allowed it to watch really in near real time a lot of really important Iranian nuclear activities, allowed it to request access to undeclared nuclear facilities and to go there and take samples. So some really important and powerful tools that were really core to the JCPOA, many of which have now apparently been lost. Although Iran has managed to sort of reach that last minute deal with the IAEA that at least provide for some of those monitoring mechanisms and for the IAEA to be able to access those down the road in 3 months, and we can talk more about that. And then, of course, I don't think we should miss that there's also been some pretty provocative statements by Iranian officials, including the supreme leader, who talked about how Iran will go to whatever level of enrichment it needs to for its nuclear needs, including 60% enriched uranium, which is obviously much higher and gets you much closer to that 90% level. And the intelligence minister also stated that if pushed, Iran might change its mind and ultimately build nuclear weapons. So all of this to say is that a lot of these tactics are part of a strategy we've seen from Iran, for a long time now, for many, many years on the nuclear program, which is that it's trying to raise the temperature, it's trying to raise the pressure on the United States, and in the Biden administration in particular, in this case, to force the United States back into the nuclear deal and provide sanctions relief. And that's really what Iran wants in this case, is that sanctions relief. It cares a little bit less about whether the United States actually rejoins the deal. So that's really where it's headed. But obviously it's trying to do that and calibrate those steps in a way that avoids provoking a harsh international reaction and putting Iran even in a worse position. But my read of the situation, particularly before Iran struck that deal with the IAEA, and perhaps even moving forward, is that there's a risk, I think, that Iran is overplaying its hand a little bit, right? The moves that I just described moments ago, these I think are more aggressive than a lot of what Iran's done to date and what Iran did after the Trump administration withdrawal from the JCPOA. So if you remember, after that time, Iran took a year off, basically, where it said, hey, we're going to sort of hit pause, we're not going to do anything. And then a year later, Iran started slowly and gradually rolling back its nuclear commitments. It telegraphed its moves every 60 days. So it said, hey, 60 days from now, we're going to do X. And we're telling you in advance what that is. So it did it in a very calibrated way. But what we've seen since December is that Iran is is playing hardball a little bit more, and it's moving more aggressively. It's taking, it's moving out faster. The steps it's doing, tinkering with inspections, are far more provocative than the smaller gradual moves that Iran was doing before. And so, I think there's a risk that Iran runs in doing this, is that, after 4 years where the US under the Trump administration was kind of perceived as the aggressor and sort of the obstinate actor, that table is going to be flipped, and where Iran is now going to be in those shoes, and it's going to lose its status as the aggrieved party. So I think the big question looming right now is whether Iran is going to attend these talks that are trying to be arranged, where the U.S. is an invited guest of the JCPOA members. And I hope it does, because I think that's really the most important step in the near term to get diplomacy back on track and see if we can strike a deal or get back into the JCPOA.
So let me ask Hannah this question. I mean, you've watched the Iranians negotiate a lot. Are the Iranians overplaying their hand? Have they learned the right lessons from the way the US negotiates? Or are the Iranians playing with fire? Is this likely to get them where they want to go, do you think? Can they not help themselves? Or is this risking it all?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and hellos to everybody. I would step back a second, because I think it's important to, you mentioned this past decade of experience of mine. And I want to just use that for a second and just think, as all of us maybe think for a second, if we have seen any of these moves by the Iranians before. And sometimes I think we, when there's, I sense this a lot in the past 2-3 weeks, that there was this thing going on, that there was a feeling of a crisis mode. If it's a crisis, that something is really going wrong, something is happening. And what I try
among
to—
the Iranians or among the Americans or among the Europeans?
Generally in the atmosphere between Iran and the US, and Iran and the Europeans as well. It's not just the US in this sense, because Europeans were very much involved in this, especially the steps that Eric mentioned. And I think it was not that much of a crisis in the past 2-3 weeks as it was portrayed, or as maybe Iran wanted to portray. It was not that. I think we have seen since, especially during the talks that led us into the JPOA and afterwards the very long negotiations which resulted in JCPOA, we have seen so many of these instances that there was a situation that we felt like, oh, things are really falling apart and they're not going to reach a deal. This is not happening. It's impossible. And then it happened. So I want to say that the crisis was not there, or if it was there, it was not so serious. What we're seeing today, at least looking at the comments of President Rouhani a few hours ago, Supreme Leader Khamenei from a few days ago, a couple of days ago, it's quite apparent that Iran wants this thing. Iran wants JCPOA to be revived. Iran certainly wants the sanction relief. And Iran is ready for a sort of meeting to talk and negotiate the way back to JCPOA. And this I say because this has been said by the Iranian officials. Foreign Minister Zarif has mentioned this since November, just right after the Biden election. We heard him say it, that this would need some technical talks. If he's phrasing this or portraying this as technical talks rather than negotiations, this I don't know why he's using this technical talk so much. Maybe because there are some stumbling blocks which we can talk about. What can those things be? But it's obvious that Iran wants back. If it's playing with the fire, we don't know, because as Eric knows very well, Iran has threatened to even leave the NPT down the line if this thing doesn't work out. It's the unspoken clause of the letter Hassan Rouhani wrote to the 4+1 leaders and threatened that Iran down the line can even leave the NPT. But I don't think that Iran can go there because it needs so much, and it shows it every day. Now we had the Foreign Minister Zarif speaking with the South Koreans. It's clear that they want to go back if the US, how Iran says, goes back into the deal.
So let me ask Eric, I mean, you've been paying attention to the Iranian economy for a long time. You keep an eye on Iranian political pressures. How much urgency do the Iranians feel to make a deal? We've seen 2 years of a maximum pressure campaign by the United States that certainly didn't collapse the regime, but do they feel now that they don't have a choice but to come back into the deal?
John, was that one to me or Henry?
I'm sorry, to Henry. I apologize.
Yeah.
No, not a problem. And thanks, John, and the whole CSIS team. And great to be here with Hannah and Eric. So yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely correct that the economy is under a frankly quite severe amount of pressure. U.S. sanctions remain quite powerful. They haven't been reduced in intensity at all since President Biden took office. And I think they are poised to continue that way unless there's progress on the diplomatic front. Just a few kind of statistics to throw out. I mean, inflation remains around 30%. That's, I think, kind of a lowball estimate, which has kind of a grinding effect on basic economic activity. Growth is expected to be fairly tepid this year, between 1.5% to 3%, but coming off quite a low baseline after several years of pretty severe contraction. And while Iranian oil exports may be as high as 1 million barrels per day, I think it's worth kind of emphasizing that the Iranians themselves have been quite clear, that the government has, that they are not actually getting the revenue that one would expect from selling 1 million barrels per day. So even if that number has improved over time, the actual money that the government gets to play with in terms of paying salaries, in terms of funding other expenditures, just isn't there. So I think often in Washington, there's kind of presented a binary between the economy is on the verge of collapse, however one would define collapse, or the economy is kind of completely resistant to sanctions and they can kind of keep going like this indefinitely. And I think neither is really true. I think it's frankly down the middle. I think, I guess the question, to tie it back to the earlier conversation, is how do these economic realities interact with the political economy and political pressures? And I think there's a bit of a countervailing impulse from the Iranian leadership that while there is this significant economic pressure, at all costs, the Iranians do not want to appear desperate. They do not want to appear that they need a deal more than the U.S. does. I think they consider that integral to maintaining their leverage in these negotiations. So I think we're seeing both of these play out. And I think and I guess just as a final point, I did want to draw some distinction between the positions of the president and the foreign minister Zarif as separate from the supreme leader and the supreme leader's office. I think from the point of view of President Rouhani and foreign minister Zarif, I mean, their time is almost up. The election is in June. New president takes over in August. I think they view, I think in quite a kind of a rational political way, that resurrecting or at least making major progress on JCPOA before that is key to their future political survival and key to that of their allies. I think the supreme leader does not have the same calculation. I think, and I think there's a certain degree of ambivalence from his point of view, whether there's progress immediately or after the election. On the one hand, he wants to generate, I think, some positive economic, either kind of actual progress or hints of it, to try to generate more optimism and drive turnout in the election. And on the other hand, there's, I think, a bit of caution about trying to really empower Rouhani and Zarif and their cadre of people to perhaps undermine his plans for the election. I think this is a point that Hannah and others have kind of outlined before, but I think it's important to emphasize.
Thank you. Just for members of our audience, if you have questions for the panelists, there's a link in the chat page, and you can put your questions in. Given that background that we've heard Eric and Hannah and Henry lay out, is the right negotiating approach this sort of idea of freeze for freeze? We do something small, we try to build confidence, we try to create the feedback loop. Eric, you've spent a lot of time thinking about nuclear negotiations. Are we in the place where we should have confidence building measures? And how should we think about actions by the Iranians that seem to refute confidence building measures?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic here. I certainly think there's a role that confidence building measures can play. And you can take some steps to, I think, reverse and erode the mistrust that's built up over 4 years of the Trump administration. I think the United States has done a few things in this regard, right? I mean, it's decided that it's made a decision that snapback did not take place. It's reversed that call of the last administration, which I think is smart in its own right, but I think that's obviously a positive step. It's also done away with some of the added restrictions on Iranian diplomats. Again, a good signal and a positive step. And as I alluded to earlier, we've seen Iran pull back from the worst possible outcome with the IAEA. That keeps some of that monitoring in place. And so I think there's probably a few things you could do in addition to that to help at least normalize or reduce the tensions that exist. One of those things may be for the US to waive sanctions that have been imposed on certain types of nuclear cooperation projects that were permitted under the JCPOA that I think, at least the expert community on this resolutely views as in the US non-proliferation interest, because it makes these facilities less able to be used for nuclear weapons. So I think that's another step that the United States could take that wouldn't yield any major leverage that it has. And so I think there's small things like this, but I don't think you're going to get to a place where Iran is actually rolling back some of the steps it's taken, or the US is actually providing sanctions relief. I think that's still probably a bridge too far. And I think the first option in my mind is to at least test the waters and see if the United States and Iran can achieve a return back to the JCPOA, right? Because that's what the United States has signaled that it wants. That's what Iran has said that it wants. And so I think it would be a little bit strange to come into those meetings and first try for the freeze for freeze, sort of deal before trying to do the return that both the United States and Iran claim to want. And that Iranian position has certainly been one that has been consistent even under the Trump administration, right? They have talked about, the goal is to return to the deal, and then we can have sort of conversations about what follows next, although some of the recent comments roll that back a bit.
So let me ask Henry about that, if I can. I mean, Henry, are we going to be able to get back to the JCPOA and then work the other stuff later, do the follow-on stuff? I mean, can we do the big thing early and get back to status quo ante?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, yes, that there is a clear path forward here. Though I would say, and I want to underscore that I think Eric's initial steps about talking about rolling back the waivers, or rather issuing waivers related to non-proliferation steps, and others that have been thrown around, such as removing objections to an IMF loan. I think those are good ideas. I think they should be thought of, though, in the narrow context of what do we need to do to bring Iran to the table, and kind of nothing more. I don't think we should get kind of carried away with the idea that each side should do reciprocal positive measures outside of the context of negotiations. And here I harken back a bit to the one episode of U.S.-Iran history under the George H.W. Bush administration, in terms of this idea of goodwill for goodwill, which I wouldn't kind of bore the audience with this story, but because Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, has actually used this phrase before in just a few weeks ago. And I think the kind of lesson from that episode was that if the two sides aren't really talking to each other and don't have a kind of clear understanding of what steps are equivalent to what steps, and how kind of there is kind of clear, coordinated, synchronized efforts forward, I think it just breeds further mistrust and can frankly collapse and end up in a worse place than you started. So I think, just kind of to underscore, I think the goal is to get back to negotiations, and what happens at the table, I think is I think that's where you could talk about smaller steps that would build confidence. But I think it has to be within a context of the two sides talking, whether it's technical talks or informal talks or whatever branding the Iranians want to put on it. I think that should be, I would offer, the U.S. fundamental goal right now.
So Hannah, if we're in those talks and we see actions like the attacks by forces aligned with Iran against U.S. facilities, if we saw another event like the attack on the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais, or bombing of tankers in the Gulf of Oman like we saw in May 2019, how should the U.S. think about whether these things that happen outside the negotiation room and outside the space of the nuclear issue, how should those affect discussions on the nuclear issue? Should the U.S. ignore them? Should the U.S. respond as if there are no talks going on? I mean, it seems to me clear that this is part of a concerted Iranian government effort. Should the U.S. just ignore that?
Well, you're a better person to answer this question, first of all. But that's why events like this, although the nature of the events which you mentioned are different, and the at least supposed role of the Iranian proxies are debated, especially, for example, the recent one in Erbil, where the Iran-aligned group, basically in quite a rare event, denied its role in an attack in Erbil and so on. But that's why there are these events that make the situation, I'm not contradicting myself from the previous answer, but makes the situation sort of volatile and fragile. That's why sort of extending the time to fix the situation with this JCPOA, to not fix it, but maybe stabilize the situation with the JCPOA becomes necessary, and it's important that it happens. I'm sure the U.S. administration has better answered as me here sitting in Prague, but obviously there are certain elements inside the US policy when it comes to the Middle East that are also important, or as important as the situation with the nuclear deal. Especially, we saw it in the first weeks of the Biden administration, how it decided to act on an issue like Yemen. And these are the issues, such as Yemen, are the issues that by not having Iran at the table, or by not convincing Iran to play a positive role in that process, it's not going to be solved. One thing. So basically, stabilizing the JCPOA situation to many today sounds like a better idea to go and take care of other concerns when it comes to Iran in the region and in the groups that it's supporting. But back to how these things are going to work, how these steps or baby steps are going to work with Iran. Honestly, I understand Eric's point on the non-proliferation front, but I also think that those kind of steps are not going to be enough, at least from what we hear from the Islamic Republic today, from all officials all over the board. They are not going to be convinced, and the Supreme Leader is not going to be able to convince his own followers, today the principalists in the parliament, with the steps such as the ones on non-proliferation, and when it doesn't include something like sanction relief or IMF loan and these sort of things, or blocked assets of Iran. And
so I want to start bringing in some questions we've gotten from the audience. And Professor Jeff McCausland from Dickinson College asks whether you think that these attacks in Iraqi Kurdistan on US facilities are a demonstration of a divided view in Iran, or an effort to show Iranian independence. So is this the good guys and the bad guys fighting a shadow war, and the bad guys trying to undermine negotiations, or does this represent a strategy by the Iranian government, in your view? That's for you.
Is that question for me?
That's for you.
Well, there are different views, as you well know, about this issue, because it depends on if we're going to consider the Islamic Republic as a united front, or if we're going to divide Islamic Republic into certain factions and groups, and we want to consider those who are in favor of negotiations and those who are not. This really depends on how we look at the Islamic Republic. And in my opinion, it can be very much both of these scenarios. We have seen several events in the past weeks and months that when something diplomatic development was happening, or it was supposed to happen, if it was a foreign trip of an Iranian official or a foreign delegation going to Iran, these sort of events happened. How much it had to do with these kind of diplomatic developments, I cannot say, because finally there was not enough evidence to show who was doing what. But it is clearly happening, and I can't say for sure if it's the Islamic Republic or the factions within the Islamic Republic who are not in favor of it.
So let me bring in Henry. I mean, you've spent a lot of time thinking about Iranian politics and the way these manifest themselves. You mentioned we have these presidential elections coming up in June. Is that a deadline? Is it an opportunity? How should we think about the importance of presidential elections as shaping both what the Iranians might be willing to do, might be able to do, and whether that provides more of an opportunity or more of a threat for U.S. negotiators?
Sure. So I mean, I think for President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, the June election is a deadline. But for I don't think we should think of it that way. You know, the Iranians have a tendency, I think, to overplay their in negotiations with the United States, to overplay the role of domestic divisions as a way to force action from the U.S. The idea that you know, you need to help us against our hardliners at home kind of attitude that I think we've heard over the years, and I think frankly that doesn't hold up in this case when it comes to the election. I think the Islamic Republic at a strategic level has made a decision that it wants to get back into JCPOA under certain circumstances, and that wouldn't change whether you know, a extreme radical president is elected or a kind of run-of-the-mill conservative is elected. And I don't think we should get into, we as coming from an American point of view, should get into the kind of trap of thinking that this is that the elections are a deadline, that we have to make progress with the current team. Because I think it carries a few assumptions. One that I just mentioned in terms of that the person that comes next will be more difficult to work with, and I think there's also an assumption that the U.S. wouldn't be able to work with the same team, which I think hasn't held up over the years. For example, Abbas Araghchi, who has been the deputy foreign minister and is quite close to the supreme leader, has been involved over several administrations in nuclear talks, either at the forefront or more behind the scenes. So, you know, I think from a strategic level, Iran has made a choice, and I think the U.S. should really be driven by ensuring it achieves its objectives as opposed to being cornered into this June deadline.
When I did a interview with Jake Sullivan for CSIS, that's on the CSIS website, we did it back in June, and Jake had the really interesting phrasing: the election of Rouhani was not irrelevant toward the outcome of nuclear diplomacy, but it was also not dispositive, which I think is very much in the lines that you're suggesting, that it might affect some of the coloration, but the strategic decision is to move forward. Eric, when you're negotiating this stuff, we have a series of challenges. It's not just getting back into the JCPOA, it's figuring out all the other stuff that needs to be negotiating, not least fixing what went wrong with the JCPOA, in particular sort of the snapback from an Iranian perspective. The Iranians never saw the economic benefits that they anticipated. In your view, when does that get addressed in the negotiations? How fixable are those problems? And we have a question on our list of whether there needs to be a sort of snapback provision on the Iranian side too. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, some of the issues you raised, whether it's you know, the future of snapback and some of those other, I think, you know, risks that Iran might not fully enjoy the benefits of the sanctions relief that come with a deal. I think those are things that get addressed for the most part in follow-on agreements. There's probably some things that the United States can do if and when we get back into the JCPOA that help ease some of the constraints that Iran has on benefiting from sanctions relief. But I think things like snapback, you know, the risk that a future US president could walk out of another deal and reimpose sanctions unilaterally, those things are way, way too complicated to address as part of getting back into the JCPOA. And so I think Iran knows that. And I think, you know, their public comments on this have shifted over time. And I think now they kind of recognize those things need to be put off. And I think that's actually one thing that the United States can offer as a carrot for follow-on negotiations on the nuclear issue, which Iran has, you know, more recently thrown up some barriers to and said that this is it, the JCPOA is it. But I think, you know, putting things on the table like more extensive sanctions relief, being willing to perhaps be flexible on things like snapback and considering those things, because in reality, those are going to be the Iranian demands, right? Like we have a set of demands that we're going to come in. We're going to want, to extend timelines and nuclear restrictions. We're going to want to enhance transparency measures. Well, guess what? Iran's going to have its own list. So I think we need to be thinking about those things as well when we enter into those negotiations.
Well, and as Mohammed Islami, one of the audience participants, suggests that there are also Europeans involved in these talks, plus Russians and Chinese. Are there key differences in the approach that you see toward re-entering JCPOA, toward ongoing negotiations between the US and the E3?
Yeah, I don't think there's huge differences on returning to the deal and getting back in. You may start to see some fissures open up when conversations begin about how to build on the deal, because these are things that I think, haven't really been thought through on any of these sides. And whether if the US goal is to lengthen and strengthen the nuclear restrictions in the JCPOA and also address regional issues and also address missile issues, how do you sequence all of those? How do you, do you do them in separate tracks? So I think there's a lot to be thought through that just hasn't been done. I could easily see some differences emerging between the United States and Europe on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, as you start to tackle some of these broader issues where that have the interests of all the different parties are more complex than they are when it just comes to issues like non-proliferation. So I think there could be some stumbling blocks there. And I think the relationships between the United States and Russia and the United States and China now are just not what they were when the JCPOA was negotiated, although Russia and China were helpful in that regard. So I think when it comes to these additional steps and going further, I think that's going to be harder. If I could just comment really quickly on the political discussion,
yeah.
On should we be hemmed in by the election deadline? I would completely agree with Henry's comments and Hannah's comments that she made in this regard. I don't think we should let the Iranian election cause us to do other things that we wouldn't otherwise do. I would see this window as a somewhat valuable window where we could potentially make progress because of the interest of the Iranian administration. But I guess I would differ a little bit where I do think the president of Iran does matter, right? I think, yes, the regime can make a strategic decision and the supreme leader is obviously the final decision maker in this regard. But I do think having a more hardline Iranian president can frustrate, prolong, and make talks harder because, let's be honest, a lot of what it comes down to is the details of these discussions. And so I think that the president can and will matter for the future of dialogue.
Is there a consensus on this panel of whether Javad Zarif is likely to continue as foreign minister after August?
That's a decision for the supreme leader of Iran, I would say.
I would say unlikely he continues as foreign minister. I was thinking of this point this morning, John, about whether he could potentially continue to serve as an almost special envoy to America and a kind of a mirror image of what the U.S. State Department has. I think it's possible, but I would see this falling more towards folks like Araghchi to carry this on if it went past August.
Because I mean, Zarif, as many of my Trump administration friends have bemoaned, is incredibly effective speaking to Western audiences. My friend Tom Warwick at the Atlantic Council asked, who's winning the information war? And I would even push it to play out the information war over the next 6 months. Do you think this is something where the Iranians are going to be able to assert message dominance and shift things in their direction? Or, as I think Hannah was suggesting, are they risking losing their position as the aggrieved party? And can the Biden team shift it not only in the US, but around the world toward the Biden approach? How's the information war playing out and how will it play out for whoever wants to take it?
I'd offer that the script has somewhat flipped over the past few weeks, that I think the Biden team has done a fairly concerted job of making it clear that they are willing to re-engage, renegotiate, and that it's basically up to the Iranians to decide how to take it from there. And Yeah, I mean, I think that view would probably prevail in Western Europe as well. Russia and China, as kind of Eric indicated, differ from the U.S. and the Europeans on a number of Iran-related issues, setting aside the nuclear front. But I would offer that I think if the Iranians play quite hard to get over the next few months, that would be to their detriment, not to recognize that there's an opportunity at play here.
I'll also hop in, and I agree with Henry. I think the one instance where that could potentially change is if and when we get to the discussion on the scope of U.S. sanctions relief and how that's going to play out as part of the return. That might be another area where Iran sort of steps up its messaging game and finds some potential narratives that it wants to advance and exploit as part of that. Because I think that's going to be contentious. That's going to be a contentious discussion about return to the deal, probably more so than the sequencing and sort of the technical steps on the Iranian side.
How do you see the politics playing out in the U.S. and Iran as we get toward basically giving stuff to the other side? Is there a view, Hannah, among the Iranian public that the JCPOA approach didn't work and Rouhani got taken? Is there skepticism that really there will be goodwill coming from the U.S.? And Eric and Henry, from a U.S. side, when you start sending money to the Iranians, and then suddenly whatever happens with it, whether it's with the Houthis or Hezbollah or anybody else, it becomes because the Iranians have money, because they made a deal. That's why more people are dying. That's why there are more terrorists riding high. So let's start, Hannah, with the Iran side. Is there an appetite to go down this road again, to really try to make a new agreement or even get into the old one?
So I'm glad you asked, because this is very important, especially because in the US, this is a totally different thing. But in Iran, this is something that has to do with the everyday life of each and every Iranian. When it comes to sanctions, tensions with the West, each second of it has an impact on the life of an ordinary Iranian. That's why they are news savvy, they're following every step of the way. If they are as enthusiastic as they were in 2013, 14, 15, things have changed. There is no question. Iranians have seen different things throughout these years. They have seen protests, they have seen killings, crackdowns, executions, downing of a civilian plane. They have seen enough. But that doesn't mean that if they are against the regime, even, that doesn't mean that if they recognize the human rights violations, and I'm not speaking from the streets of Tehran. I'm sitting in Prague. It's true. I want to be realistic here. But it is there is no question that there is a portion of the society which thinks that less tension, less sanctions is going to benefit my personal life. How enthusiastic or how much welcoming they will be if they would go and welcome a foreign minister at Tehran airport, I'm not sure about that. They are not happy about many things, especially in the past couple of years. But obviously, they're looking forward for better life, which might come from some less sanction pressure on the country.
So let me just follow up, because we have a question from one of my former star students, Sahar Norizadeh, who's now at the Belfer Center where Henry escaped from. She asked if you can share thoughts on how Iran's nuclear decision-making and P5+1 unity might be affected in the near term if the US doesn't at least immediately provide some relief from sanctions previously imposed and suspended under the JCPOA for primarily nuclear-related matters, but then reimposed under counterterrorism authorities under President Trump. I should add, by the way, that I guess, Eric, did you work with Zahar at the NSC?
No, not directly. I think we crossed paths in a couple of different
Okay.
sort of venues, but
Anyway, so Hannah, what do you make of that question? I mean, does there need to be sanctions relief?
Is it for me or Henry?
Yeah, for you.
Okay, can you repeat that, please? Because I thought it was more of a Henry question.
Okay, so can you share thoughts on how Iran's nuclear decision-making and P5+1 unity might be affected in the near term if the US doesn't at least immediately provide relief from sanctions previously imposed and suspended under the JCPOA for things in the nuclear file, but then reimposed under the Trump administration for things?
It's not going to work. I don't think it's going to work because there have been discussions in the past weeks in some circles. I think Henry has some ideas about this too, but I think those sanctions, which have been sort of like it changed its nature from non-proliferation to terrorism related and so on. I don't think it will work, but obviously, as we have heard from so many different officials in the past weeks, from Europeans, from Americans, from analysts, this is not an easy path forward.
Henry, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question kind of speaks to two different issues, and it's an extremely precise question here. And I think one issue is the fact that the U.S. and Iran will need to negotiate over sanctions relief because the Trump administration, for very transparent purposes, tried to make it more difficult for a subsequent administration to relieve sanctions by issuing relabeling of specific sanctions designations under terrorism authorities. So that's part of the reason why I think this process is going to be a lot longer and more difficult to negotiate than I think many anticipate, because it will require untangling these. And I think the Biden administration, kind of politically and from national security reasons, cannot simply revert to January 20th, 2017 status quo ante, which is what the Iranians have called for. I think the second part of the question, which is equally important here, is as this drags on, if my kind of view of this is right, which it might not be, but let's just assume that this takes a longer time than just a couple months. I think we do see a return to kind of, as Eric said, Iran had kind of stepped back over the past 5 days or so from the brink. I think we will see over time, as Hannah's kind of witnessed, the Iranians using nuclear capabilities to dial up or dial down pressure in very precise increments. And I think the IAEA's reporting just yesterday kind of indicates that Iran, for instance, has been keeping a fairly consistent level of production of low enriched uranium, even though they've been installing a huge number of advanced centrifuges, which says to me that they're making a choice to keep production at a kind of moderate level and not ramping up significantly. And the flip side of that is, of course, that yes, we can ramp up significantly if we choose to. So I do think that as this goes on, there will be a lot of signaling in that nuclear realm from the Iranian side.
So let me ask Eric to both reflect on that and also reflect on, if we get to the point where the Iranians are signaling a lot, how do you think that affects the politics in the United States? How would it affect the U.S. willingness to continue to go down this road? Because, as I said, the politics will be alert to this. And the answer will seem to be, I think, among some, that the Iranian response to U.S. concessions is more bad behavior. So first,
yeah,
you're right. And second, how do you deal with the politics?
And so I think this gets back to the other question too, is sort of like, what is the domestic political angle to all of this? I mean, I think the more that Iran does on the nuclear front, I think that makes it harder, politically. And this is true for the discussion of sanctions relief as well. Like you talked about earlier, John, as soon as, sanctions relief starts happening and Iran has access to its money, that sort of, there's a political reaction to that in the United States. I think a lot of that is misplaced personally. but I think we can't ignore the politics of this. And so for me, actually, that's one of the reasons why I think a return to the JCPOA itself is almost easier in some ways than trying to craft a smaller deal, because you're trying to come up with new arrangements. Those new arrangements may need to go back to Congress, and so there's some hurdles there. And so I think there's also additional things the United States can do on this front, right? We talked about the regional issues a second ago, but I think the United States can sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, where we try and work with Iran to get a deal, whether that's a return to the JCPOA or some sort of freeze for freeze, and we continue to push back against regional activities in the missile program. I do think one of the things that the Biden administration should consider is continuing with some of the efforts by the Trump administration to enhance interdictions against some of Iran's conventional proliferation. Those things, can still take place. Those are things that should, they're valuable in and of their own right, and there are also things that, politically speaking, show that the United States is not, ignoring these other very objectionable Iranian activities. So I think those are things that can and should be done.
So Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, who's the KRG representative, asked the quite relevant question of how do you avoid the neighborhood becoming the battleground for this sort of squabbling between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear file? How do you keep the KRG from becoming the victim of either the success or the failure of these negotiations? Erica, goes right to the point you were making, that you have to have a policy toward all these things, but there's a way in which they can get sucked in, and they can be tied, and if it doesn't go well, it could all go poorly for everybody. Is there a way to guard against that? Should we insulate some of these issues, or is it all of a piece?
Was that to me?
Yeah, I thought it would start with you.
Yeah, no. So I think that the general practice of the Obama administration on this was right. I think you keep the nuclear issue separate. You work on that. You deal with that. You base your decisions there on your interests vis-a-vis nuclear issues, right? And you deal with these other complications in separate ways and separate channels. And you don't let those types of things change your policy vis-a-vis the nuclear issue. And so I think that's still something that can and should be done. I would also note that I think when the United States was in the JCPOA, the regional situation was a little bit better in terms of attacks against U.S. forces. And so I think there's, the answer isn't always like we need to go harder against, Iran's malign activity in the region, because otherwise it's going to endanger the JCPOA or some sort of nuclear negotiations. But I think, I don't think we should let ourselves become confused by these issues and have them bleed over and alter our interests and objectives in ways that aren't particularly helpful.
Henry, Hannah, do you want to come in on that before I ask you an unfair parting question?
I just make one point to kind of borrow a phrase, I believe, from David Ben-Gurion, the idea, or the construct, the idea of that the United States can counter Iran as if there are no negotiations and pursue negotiations as if there's no outside conflict with Iran. Right. I think we can do both at the same time. And I think they kind of positively reinforce each other.
So the last question as we close out is the most unfair, which is I want you to predict where we're going to be July 1st. Are we going to have a big deal, a little deal, no deal? Is there going to be a perception of having some momentum and on the brink of more stuff? Or is there going to be confusion and a sense that the Iranians have to figure out what they want before we can move forward? I guess the very short version is, should Rob Malley plan a vacation in July or not? Hannah, do you want to lead off?
I think he will deserve a vacation in July, because honestly, I want to go back to the title of this meeting, which is the freeze for freeze. And I think it's a bit problematic to talk about freeze for freeze and not mentioning that one side's freeze is to, I mean, for the US, the freeze should be freeze of a non-participation in a nuclear deal. And if Iran is insisting on that, it means that US will at least announce a willingness or its intention in a formal way to go back into a deal. If that is the scenario, then I would say that is the momentum that you're talking about until July 1st and a vacation for Rob Malley.
Eric, do you buy that?
Me unmute myself. I take a slightly different take, and I think come July, I think we will be. I'm hopeful we will be in one of two places, either on our way towards returning to the JCPOA with both sides coming back into compliance and taking steps in that regard, or at least some type of de-escalated pause, if you will, on some of the nuclear activities. But I think this really depends on two things. The first is whether or not Iran is willing to come to the table, not just once, but we need to have a sustained dialogue. We're all kind of wrapped around the axle on whether or not everyone's gonna end up back there under the sort of the invitation of the EU. But we need to not just do that once, we're gonna need to do it many, many, many times. And so the question is, can we do that? Can that process be sustained? So that's the first big question. And I think, as we talked about earlier, the other question is, can the United States and Iran agree on the terms and the scope and the type of sanctions relief? That is the other big question. And so I think those two things are really what I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to over the coming months when we try and all think about predicting where we're going to be in the summer.
Henry is already on Cape Cod, so I think you're already planning your vacation. So you gonna stick around on July 1, or what's going to happen?
Well, I do hope for everyone's sake that we're all able to contemplate the word vacation by July 1st. But I just want to say specifically, I think U.S. and Iran and the remaining parties will be in talks on in July. They will not have returned to compliance with JCPOA yet. I think the U.S. will probably either to get Iran to the talks or perhaps as in the beginning of talks issue some small measure of sanctions relief, but not a whole lot. And I think they're an overall positive trajectory, but talks are messy. You have to negotiate the sanctions issues, which we've talked about briefly, as well as I think a U.S. political imperative to secure some Iranian commitment to follow on negotiations and regional/missile negotiations as well. So I think it'll be it won't be a quiet summer, no matter how you cut it.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for your participation, your excellent questions. Thanks very much to my very thoughtful and insightful panelists. I learned a lot, and I'm grateful to you. We are going to not only post the video, we'll post a transcript of the talk for your reference as soon as we can get it up. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks again to the panelists, and we hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.